High above the English Channel in the late summer of 1940, a massive formation of German bombers materialized through the coastal haze. The traditional military response to such an overwhelming aerial armada would have been to launch standing patrols, forcing defending fighters to loiter in the sky, burning precious fuel while waiting for an enemy that might never arrive. In a war of attrition, this blind guessing game would have guaranteed the destruction of the defending forces. The math of survival in the Battle of Britain was brutally simple and entirely against the defenders. The Royal Air Force was vastly outnumbered by a Luftwaffe that had just steamrolled across Western Europe. Relying on visual spotting by coastal observers was a relic of a bygone era, far too slow and wildly inaccurate to counter the speed of modern monoplane bombers. If the defenders scrambled only when they saw the enemy with their own eyes, the bombs would already be falling by the time their landing gear retracted. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding recognized that the fighter aircraft itself was merely the kinetic edge of the blade. The true weapon required to stop the German war machine was a centralized architecture of information. He conceived and championed the Dowding System, a revolutionary command structure designed to synthesize disparate streams of incoming data into a single, actionable picture of the battle space. It was an unprecedented leap from localized guesswork to integrated information warfare. The physical manifestation of this vision began at the very edge of the British coastline. The chain-home radar network stood as a series of massive steel towers casting invisible electromagnetic nets out over the sea. These early radar stations could detect incoming aircraft up to 100 miles away, stripping the Luftwaffe of its most critical tactical advantage, which was the element of surprise. Inside the cramped, dimly lit huts beneath those towering masts, operators stared at primitive cathode ray tubes for hours on end. The psychological strain was immense as they translated erratic, glowing blips into precise estimates of enemy altitude, bearing, and numbers. They performed this grueling cognitive translation while fully aware that their radar stations were primary targets for German dive bombers screaming down from the clouds above. But raw data generated at the coast was entirely useless if it could not reach the cockpits of the defending fighters in time. The critical transition from isolated sensor readings to a unified defensive posture required an entirely new type of nervous system. Thousands of miles of dedicated underground telephone cables were laid across the country, creating a secure, high-speed conduit that bypassed the civilian exchanges entirely. All of those subterranean copper lines converged deep underground at Bentley Priory, the nerve center of Fighter Command. Here, inside the filter room, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force synthesized the chaotic influx of radar readings, visual spotting reports, and radio intercepts. Armed with croupier rakes, they pushed colored wooden blocks across a massive map of Britain, filtering out duplicate reports and phantom echoes to establish a single, verified truth of the enemy's location. This underground choreography was a desperate race against the physics of aviation. A German bomber flying at 250 miles per hour would cross the coast and reach London in mere minutes. The operators at Bentley Priory had to process the incoming data, identify the threat, and relay the verified track to the regional group headquarters before the enemy formation even crossed the English shoreline. From group headquarters, the targeting orders cascaded down to the individual sector airfields, where the final tactical executions took place. Alarms shattered the quiet of the dispersal huts as pilots sprinted to their waiting Hurricanes and Spitfires. They did not take off to search the empty sky. They were launched on precise mathematical vectors, guided by sector controllers, who constantly updated the intercept coordinates via high-frequency radio. For the pilots strapped into the freezing, vibrating cockpit, survival required an absolute surrender of instinct. They had to trust the disembodied voice crackling in their headsets over their own intuition, flying blindly through thick cloud cover on the promise that the controller would guide them to the target. The terrifying isolation of aerial combat was mitigated only by the invisible tether connecting them back to the plotting tables on the ground. The results of this coordinated interception model were devastating to the German offensive. Luftwaffe commanders were repeatedly baffled by the Royal Air Force's uncanny ability to materialize out of the sun exactly where and when they were most lethal. Believing the British possessed an endless reserve of fighter squadrons, German intelligence failed to realize that the same small pool of aircraft was simply being deployed with surgical, ruthless efficiency. This fundamental misunderstanding led to a fatal strategic miscalculation in Berlin. Hermann Göring directed his bombers to relentlessly pound the British fighter airfields and the coastal radar masts, attempting to crush the enemy's physical assets. Yet the Luftwaffe entirely failed to comprehend the existence of the central nervous system connecting those assets, leaving the buried telephone lines and the underground filter room completely untouched. Because the underlying architecture remained intact, the defensive network demonstrated an astonishing, organic resilience. If a sector station was bombed into rubble, its neighboring station would seamlessly absorb its radio frequencies and take over the guidance of its airborne fighters. The system was designed to route around catastrophic damage, ensuring that no single localized defeat could blind the broader defensive grid. Maintaining the integrity of this grid required agonizing, cold-blooded decisions at the highest levels of command. Earlier in the year, as France collapsed under the German blitzkrieg, Hugh Dowding had flatly refused Winston Churchill's demands to send more fighter squadrons across the Channel. Dowding understood that his entire system relied on a minimum numerical threshold of aircraft. Crossing that red line would mean the mathematical certainty of Britain's defeat. The emotional toll of this clinical resource management was borne heavily by the commanders and the plotters standing over the map tables. They watched the wooden blocks representing massive German raids push relentlessly toward heavily populated cities, knowing they simply did not have the assets to stop every bomber. They were forced to calculate which targets to abandon and which to defend, measuring national survival in the currency of civilian lives. The absolute limit of this defensive architecture was tested on the 15th of September, a day of unprecedented aerial carnage. Massive waves of German bombers darkened the skies over London, expecting to finally break the exhausted remnants of the defending forces. Instead, they were met by a perfectly synchronized wall of British fighters, vectored into position by a command network operating at its maximum theoretical capacity. The catastrophic losses suffered by the German formations on that day shattered the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility and broke the momentum of the invasion. Realizing they could never achieve the air superiority required for an amphibious assault, the German High Command quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The impenetrable shield of information had successfully repelled a vastly superior kinetic force. This victory represented a profound paradigm shift in the mechanics of global conflict. The Battle of Britain was not won merely by the turning radius of the Spitfire or the rugged durability of the Hurricane. It was won by the world's first integrated air defense network, proving definitively that the architecture of command and control was just as critical as the weapons it directed. The framework established in the underground bunkers of Bentley Priory became the foundational blueprint for the geopolitical standoffs of the decades that followed. The principles of synthesizing radar data, filtering intelligence, and centralizing command directly birthed the early warning systems of the Cold War. Every modern digital battlefield and aerospace defense command owes its fundamental operating logic to the wooden blocks pushed across those map tables. Yet the architect of this monumental achievement was granted no hero's welcome in the aftermath of the victory. Hugh Dowding, exhausted and politically isolated by his uncompromising defense of his fighter reserves, was unceremoniously dismissed from his command shortly after the immediate threat had passed. It remains one of history's bitterest ironies that the man who built the fortress was cast out the moment its walls were proven secure. His true monument is not found in bronze statues or victory parades, but in the invisible, enduring doctrine of modern warfare. The tactical origins forged in the fires of 1940 proved that victory belongs to those who master the flow of information. That centralized, unseen web of communication stands as a silent legacy, a revolutionary system that saved a fractured nation and permanently rewired the nature of human conflict. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button.